Something unusual has been happening across Europe over the past few months, and it's raising questions that religious organizations worldwide should be paying attention to. Democratic governments, nations historically known for protecting religious freedom and upholding human rights, have begun investigating, sanctioning, and restricting one of the world's largest religious organizations. First, it was Norway. Then France joined in. Now Sweden is taking similar steps. Before we dive deep into this story, if you find this kind of investigative content valuable, please consider hitting the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. And if you're able to support the channel with a super thanks, it goes directly into producing more in-depth research like what you're about to watch. Your support makes this work possible. So what exactly is happening with Jehovah's Witnesses in Europe? Is this religious persecution, as the organization claims? Or are we witnessing the consequences of internal practices that governments can no longer ignore? Let's examine the facts, look at both sides, and let you draw your own conclusions. To understand what's unfolding across Europe, we need to start in Norway, where this movement gained international attention. In late 2022, the Norwegian government made a decision that sent shockwaves through religious communities worldwide. They officially withdrew state recognition from Jehovah's Witnesses as a registered religious organization. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it carried real consequences. Without official recognition, the organization lost substantial financial benefits, including state subsidies that religious groups in Norway typically receive. More importantly, it lost the legitimacy that comes with government approval in a society where such recognition matters deeply. The Norwegian government didn't make this decision lightly. They spent years investigating complaints and gathering evidence before taking action. The specific reasons cited by Norwegian authorities centered on internal practices rather than beliefs or doctrine. The government wasn't questioning what Jehovah's Witnesses believe about God, the Bible, or salvation. Instead, they focused on how the organization treats its members, particularly those who choose to leave or who are formally expelled through a practice known as disfellowshipping. According to the official decision, these practices violated fundamental rights protected under Norwegian law. The government found evidence of what they described as psychological pressure, social isolation, and restrictions on individual freedom. They were particularly concerned about the systematic shunning of former members, a practice that can result in complete social isolation, even from immediate family members. The organization's policy requires active Jehovah's Witnesses to cut off contact with disfellowshipped individuals, treating them as if they were spiritually dead. For someone raised as a witness, this can mean losing contact with parents, siblings, children, and every friend they've ever known. The Norwegian authorities determined that this practice went beyond acceptable religious discipline and crossed into territory that violated human dignity and individual rights. Jehovah's Witnesses appealed the decision immediately, arguing that Norway was violating religious freedom and discriminating against their faith. They insisted their practices are based on biblical principles and that no one is forced to remain a member. The case went to court, and the legal battle continues. But Norway's decision had already set something in motion that would soon spread across Europe. While Norway's case was making headlines, France was quietly intensifying its own scrutiny of high-control religious groups. France has a long and complex history with what they call sectes, or sects, groups they define as having excessive influence over members' lives. The French government maintains an official watchdog agency, the Miviludes, which monitors organizations suspected of cultic practices. In recent years, French authorities have received increasing numbers of complaints about Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly from former members and families affected by the shunning policy. These weren't just anecdotal stories. They represented patterns of psychological distress, broken families, and allegations of institutional cover-ups, particularly regarding cases of child abuse. The French approach differs from Norway's, but shares the same underlying concern. Rather than withdrawing recognition, French authorities have been investigating specific allegations and building legal cases. They've been examining whether the organization's practices constitute psychological manipulation, a concept recognized under French law. Several high-profile legal cases have emerged, with former members seeking compensation for psychological damage they claim resulted from years of organizational control. What makes the French situation particularly significant is the government's focus on information control. Investigators have noted how the organization discourages members from accessing outside information, particularly criticism of the group. Members are taught to avoid apostate material, a term used for any content created by former members or critics. This creates what mental health professionals describe as an information bubble, where members only receive the organization's perspective on issues. Then came Sweden, a country renowned for its progressive values and strong protection of individual rights. Swedish authorities began reviewing how religious organizations use public funding and whether they meet the standards required to maintain their tax-exempt status. This review wasn't targeting Jehovah's Witnesses specifically, but the organization quickly became a focus of attention. Swedish officials started demanding greater transparency about internal practices, financial management, and how complaints are handled. They wanted to know how the organization deals with allegations of abuse, how decisions about disfellowshipping are made, and whether members truly have freedom to dissent or leave without severe consequences. According to a report from the Swedish government's official review published in early 2024, investigators found concerning patterns regarding how the organization handles internal discipline and whether adequate protections exist for vulnerable members, particularly children. The Swedish case is still developing, but the direction is clear. Like Norway and France, Sweden is asking whether certain religious practices, regardless of their biblical justification, can be allowed to continue when they conflict with fundamental human rights protections. When we step back and look at these three cases together, something becomes unmistakably clear. This isn't about isolated incidents or single complaints. A pattern has emerged across different countries, different legal systems, and different cultural contexts. These are not nations known for religious intolerance. Norway, France, and Sweden are among the world's most progressive democracies, with strong traditions of protecting minority rights and religious freedom. Yet they're all raising remarkably similar concerns about the same organization. The issues they're highlighting don't focus on theology or biblical interpretation. You won't find government officials questioning whether Jehovah's Witnesses have the right to believe in their version of Christianity, their rejection of the Trinity, or their expectations about a coming paradise earth. Those are matters of faith, and these governments respect that boundary. Instead, the focus is consistently on practices. Specifically, these governments are questioning the policy of systematic shunning and its devastating impact on human relationships. They're examining how the organization maintains control over information, discouraging members from reading criticism or engaging with alternative viewpoints. They're investigating allegations about how abuse cases are handled internally, particularly the requirement that two witnesses must confirm wrongdoing before action is taken, a policy that critics say protects perpetrators in cases of child sexual abuse. These governments are also looking at the level of obedience demanded from members. Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that the governing body, the group of men who lead the organization from headquarters in New York, represents God's sole channel of communication with humanity. Questioning their direction is presented as equivalent to questioning God himself. This creates what sociologists call a totalistic environment, where dissent becomes practically impossible. The psychological impact of leaving such an environment is substantial. Former members frequently report symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. They describe years of recovery from what they experienced as systematic thought control. Many struggle to rebuild their lives after losing every social connection they had. Some lose contact with their own children who remain in the organization. European authorities are asking a fundamental question that goes beyond religious freedom. They're asking whether any organization, religious or otherwise, should have the power to force this kind of total social death on individuals who simply choose to leave or who are expelled for violating rules that may have nothing to do with criminal behavior. To understand this situation fairly, we need to hear what Jehovah's Witnesses themselves say about these accusations. The organization has responded forcefully to each government action, maintaining a consistent defense across all three countries. Their primary argument centers on religious freedom. They contend that governments are interfering with their biblical right to maintain moral standards within their community. They point to scriptures like 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where the Apostle Paul instructs Christians to remove wicked persons from among themselves. They argue that disfellowshipping is a loving provision designed to help wrongdoers recognize their need to repent and return. The organization insists that no one is forced to be a Jehovah's Witness. People join voluntarily through baptism, and they can leave whenever they choose. While it's true that leaving may result in social consequences, the organization maintains that this is the natural result of choosing to reject what members believe is the truth. Family members who are witnesses have every right to limit contact with someone who has abandoned their shared faith, they argue. Regarding information control, the organization says they're simply protecting members from spiritually harmful material. They compare it to parents protecting children from dangerous influences. Just as loving parents wouldn't allow their children to consume poison, the organization says it's protecting its spiritual family from apostate poison, their term for criticism from former members. On abuse allegations, Jehovah's Witnesses have stated publicly that they abhor child abuse and cooperate with authorities when legally required. They maintain that their two-witness policy comes from biblical mandate and that they report crimes to authorities in jurisdictions where reporting is mandatory. A statement from the organization's legal representatives, presented during court proceedings in Norway, emphasized that they're being unfairly singled out for practices that many religious groups share, and that the real issue is religious discrimination disguised as human rights concern. The organization has launched legal appeals in each country, arguing that these government actions violate international protections for religious freedom. They've sought support from religious liberty organizations and presented themselves as victims of persecution, a narrative that resonates deeply with their membership, who are taught to expect opposition from Satan's world. This brings us to the heart of the matter, the question that each person watching needs to consider carefully. When multiple democratic nations with different legal traditions and cultural backgrounds, begin raising the exact same concerns about the same organization, should we dismiss this as coincidence? Should we accept the explanation that this is simply religious persecution? Or does it suggest something more fundamental might be wrong? Consider this carefully. Norway, France, and Sweden have nothing to gain politically from targeting Jehovah's Witnesses. These actions actually create complications for their governments. They face criticism from religious freedom advocates. They risk setting precedents that could affect other religious groups. They invite international scrutiny and legal challenges. Governments don't typically pursue such difficult courses of action without substantial reason. The pattern we're seeing raises uncomfortable questions about where religious freedom ends and institutional abuse begins. Religious freedom is a cornerstone of democratic society, something worth protecting vigorously. People absolutely have the right to their beliefs, to worship as they choose, to organize religiously, and to teach their faith to others. But does religious freedom extend to practices that cause severe psychological harm? Does it protect organizations that systematically isolate individuals from their families? Should it shield institutions from accountability when they handle criminal allegations internally, rather than reporting them to proper authorities? These aren't simple questions, and they don't have easy answers. Different people will weigh these competing values differently. Some will prioritize organizational autonomy and religious freedom above almost everything else. Others will argue that human rights and individual dignity must set boundaries that no organization can cross, regardless of religious justification. What's happening in Europe forces us to confront these questions directly. It's making visible something that has remained largely hidden: the human cost of practices that have operated behind closed doors for decades. Former members have been speaking out for years, but their voices were often dismissed as bitter apostates seeking revenge. Now their accounts are being investigated by governments, examined by legal professionals, and documented in official reports. The European cases are also revealing something important about institutional power. High-control religious organizations operate with remarkable freedom in most democratic societies. They claim constitutional protections while maintaining internal systems that might not survive outside scrutiny. They present one face to the public while enforcing much stricter requirements on members. They benefit from the assumption that religious organizations are inherently good and that interference would be religious persecution. But what happens when that assumption is challenged? What happens when governments decide that certain practices are unacceptable regardless of religious justification? We're watching that play out in real time across Europe. Let me be absolutely clear about something before we finish. This is not an attack on faith. This is not an attempt to mock or dismiss the sincere beliefs of millions of people who are Jehovah's Witnesses. Many of them are good people trying to live according to their conscience and what they understand to be God's requirements. They deserve respect for their dedication and sincerity. But sincerity doesn't make an organization right. Dedication doesn't mean practices shouldn't be questioned. No institution, whether religious, political, corporate, or otherwise, should operate above accountability. No group should be immune from asking whether its practices cause unnecessary harm to human beings. What's happening in Europe sends a clear signal that democracies are beginning to draw lines. They're saying that religious freedom, as precious as it is, cannot be used as a shield for practices that violate fundamental human rights. They're saying that organizations must answer questions about how they treat the most vulnerable people in their communities. They're insisting that transparency matters, even for religious institutions. This isn't the end of the story. These legal battles will continue for years. Courts will make decisions that could reshape how religious organizations operate throughout Europe and possibly beyond. The outcomes will matter far beyond Jehovah's Witnesses. They'll set precedents that affect how democratic societies balance religious freedom with individual rights. For those of you watching who have personal experience with these issues, whether as current members, former members, or family members affected by shunning, this moment matters. Your stories matter. The experiences you've lived through are being validated by governments that are finally paying attention. You're not crazy for questioning what you experienced. You're not wicked for speaking about what you witnessed. For those watching who have never been Jehovah's Witnesses but care about religious freedom and human rights, pay attention to how this unfolds. The principles at stake go far beyond one religious group. They touch on fundamental questions about power, control, accountability, and the limits of organizational authority in free societies. Where do you stand on this? What do you think about the actions these European governments are taking? Do you see it as necessary accountability or dangerous overreach? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Leave a comment below and let's have a thoughtful conversation about these complex issues. And if this kind of investigative content is valuable to you, please share this video. These stories need to reach people who can benefit from understanding what's really happening behind the carefully managed public image of high-control organizations. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep thinking critically, and never let anyone convince you that questioning authority is wrong.